Every time you say yes when you mean no, something happens inside your body that you can feel but probably cannot name. Your stomach tightens. Your jaw clenches. A low-grade resentment begins to build. And you tell yourself it is fine, that you are being helpful, that you are being kind, that saying no would be selfish or hurtful or too complicated to explain. So you say yes again, and the resentment compounds, and the exhaustion deepens. And somewhere underneath all of it, a version of you that knows exactly what it needs keeps getting quieter and quieter, until one day you realize you have no idea who you are outside of what you do for other people. This video is about boundaries, not the buzzword version, not the Instagram quote version. The real, neurological, physiological, and deeply human version. What boundaries actually are. Why the inability to set them is one of the most significant drivers of chronic stress, anxiety, burnout, and relationship dysfunction that exists. And what it actually takes to begin setting them without the guilt that has been stopping you your entire life. The first thing that needs to be said clearly is that a boundary is not a wall. A wall is designed to keep people out permanently. A boundary is designed to define where you end and where another person begins. And that definition is not a rejection of the other person. It is a declaration of your own reality. When you set a boundary, you are not saying that you do not care about the other person. You are saying that you care enough about this relationship to be honest about what you can and cannot do, what you will and will not accept, and what you need to remain a whole person within it. That distinction sounds simple. But for people who grew up in environments where their needs were dismissed, minimized, or treated as burdens, which is most people to some degree, the act of stating a need clearly and holding it firmly feels not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. Because at some point in childhood, it was. Here is the neuroscience behind why saying no feels so threatening for so many people. When you grew up in an environment where expressing needs or disagreement led to withdrawal of love, anger, conflict, or emotional punishment, your nervous system created an association between asserting yourself and danger. That association was encoded in the same threat detection circuitry that fires when you face physical danger. And because the nervous system does not distinguish between past and present threat patterns, every time you attempt to set a limit as an adult, that same circuitry activates. Your heart rate increases, your palms sweat, your voice becomes uncertain. Your mind floods with catastrophic predictions. They will be angry, they will leave, they will think I am selfish, the relationship will be destroyed. These are not irrational fears. They are old fears being activated by new situations. And understanding that distinction, that the terror you feel when setting a boundary is a memory, not a prophecy, is the beginning of being able to act differently. The connection between boundaries and chronic stress is one of the most direct and least discussed in all of wellness. Every time you override your own limits, your time, your energy, your emotional capacity, your physical needs, your body interprets that override as a threat to your well-being. And it responds the way it always responds to threat, with cortisol. The person who cannot say no to additional work responsibilities is not just tired. They are running chronically elevated cortisol levels that are measurably affecting their brain, their immune system, their cardiovascular health, and their aging process. The person who cannot set limits in their relationships is not just resentful. They are in a sustained state of physiological stress that compounds with every interaction where their needs go unvoiced and unmet. Boundaries are not just a psychological concept. They are a biological necessity. And the absence of them has physical consequences that accumulate silently over time. There are 3 types of limits that research consistently identifies as the most critical for psychological and physiological well-being. The first is time and energy limits. The ability to protect your finite personal resources from demands that exceed your capacity. This is the limit that says, I cannot take on that additional project right now, or I need to leave this event by 9, or I need an hour of uninterrupted time each morning before I am available to anyone else. People who cannot set these limits consistently experience the specific pattern of depletion that underlies burnout. not because they are weak, but because no human system can operate without recovery cycles, and time and energy limits are what create those cycles. The second type is emotional limits, the ability to define what emotional labor you are and are not available for in a given relationship or context. This is the limit that says I care about you, but I cannot be your sole emotional support. Or this conversation is affecting me in a way I need to step away from, or I am not in a state right now to hold space for this. Emotional limits do not mean you are emotionally unavailable. They mean you understand that your emotional capacity is finite, and that depleting it completely serves no one, not you and not the person you are trying to support. The third type is values-based limits, the ability to decline requests, situations, or relationships that conflict with your core values regardless of social pressure to comply. This is the most difficult type of limit to set, because it often requires disappointing people who have expectations of you that you genuinely care about. But values-based limits are the ones that, when consistently violated, produce the deepest and most corrosive form of chronic stress, the stress of living in misalignment with who you actually are. So why does guilt appear every single time you try to set a limit, even when you know intellectually that the limit is reasonable and necessary? The guilt is not random. It is a learned emotional response that was installed in you by environments where your needs were less important than keeping others comfortable. It is the internalized voice of every authority figure who responded to your natural assertiveness with disappointment, anger, or withdrawal. And it has been functioning as a surveillance system ever since, monitoring your behavior and firing an alarm every time you begin to prioritize yourself in any way. The critical insight is this: guilt after setting a limit does not mean the limit was wrong. It means the limit was unfamiliar. These are completely different things. A wrong limit harms someone or violates their legitimate rights. An unfamiliar limit activates your conditioned guilt response because it deviates from the pattern your nervous system learned to expect. Learning to distinguish between these two types of guilt, legitimate moral discomfort and conditioned emotional alarm, is one of the most liberating skills you can develop. The practical protocol for beginning to set limits without being destroyed by the guilt that follows has 3 components. The first is clarity before communication, knowing exactly what your limit is before you attempt to express it. Most people fail at limit setting, not because they lack courage, but because they are unclear about what they actually need. Before any difficult conversation, take the time to name specifically what you need, what you are willing to do, and what you are no longer available for. Clarity in your own mind dramatically reduces the anxiety of the communication and the likelihood that you will cave under social pressure. The second component is direct, non-apologetic language. The most common boundary-setting mistake is burying the actual limit under so many qualifications, apologies, and explanations that the other person never receives a clear message. I am so sorry. I know this is terrible timing. You probably think I am awful for saying this, but maybe possibly I might not be able to do that thing, is not a boundary. It is a request for permission to have a need. A boundary sounds like, I am not going to be able to do that. Or, that does not work for me. Or, I need to step away from this conversation. Short, clear, without excessive justification. The third component is tolerating the discomfort that follows. When you set a genuine boundary for the first time with someone who is accustomed to you having none, there will be a reaction. They may be surprised. They may be disappointed. They may push back. And your nervous system will interpret that reaction as confirmation that the boundary was a mistake. This is the moment that determines everything, whether you hold the boundary or collapse back into the familiar pattern of accommodation. Holding the boundary through the discomfort, without over-explaining or withdrawing it, is the single most powerful thing you can do to begin rewiring the pattern. Because every time you hold a boundary and the relationship survives, every time you say no and the world does not end, you give your nervous system updated information about what is actually safe. If you made it to the end of this video, there is probably a boundary you already know you need to set. A conversation you have been avoiding. A yes you have been saying that should be a no. A situation you have been tolerating that is costing you more than you have acknowledged. Start there. Not with the most difficult boundary in your life, with the next honest one. Write it down. Name what you need. And practice saying it in the mirror before you say it to the person who needs to hear it. Boundaries are not walls. They are the architecture of a life that is actually yours. Share this video with someone who says yes when they mean no. Because sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is show them that their needs are allowed to exist. Subscribe to continue this journey. Because the next video is going to touch something that most people have never recognized as a problem, but that is silently destroying their health, their relationships, and their sense of identity. Toxic productivity. When doing more becomes self-destruction, and why the generation that learned to measure its worth by what it produces is paying a price that nobody anticipated. See you there.